Hey everybody, Jake here from Bearded Gear, or I guess I should say in this moment from Luft Concepts. I wanted to shoot a video today just explaining how to on maintenance for the Avant. So this is the Luft Concepts Avant, designed by myself and Ryan Rimmer of Rimmer Designs, and we figured it would be a good thing to have kind of a resource for people to know how to disassemble and maintain their knife and all of that. So I wanted to go through and first kind of explain some things that a couple people have mentioned they've run into and how to fix those things, and then to go ahead and rip into this knife and get it sorted out. This is a knife that belongs to a buddy of mine. This particular one, he's just had a lot of trouble getting it to get centered. So there's a couple of things that could be happening here that we've already been figuring out. And so I'll teach you how to address those things and get it just right. And then depending on how much I need to disassemble this particular Avant, I may also in this video go so far as to do a bearing swap on my personal kind of carry Avant that I've been carrying and using pretty heavily, so that we can disassemble fully and look at some more of the internals. But a couple of things to mention first. So for centering, part of why we've been running into a little bit of an issue with some of them coming off center is frankly just because we used micarta as a scale material. So because it's micarta, sometimes micarta as a naturally kind of porous material, it can expand or contract based on temperature, humidity, stuff like that. So some of these knives, when they've gone to places like Florida where it's way more humid or something like that, if it pulls just a little bit, oh, my door is creaking, that's creepy. If it pulls or expands a little bit, it can cause the knife to just come off center. The easiest fix for that, if that's all you're running into, typically what's gonna solve that is really simple. All you're gonna wanna do is loosen all of the body screws, or even remove them completely. Just get them fully loose or all the way out, either one. And once you've loosened all of the body screws, so body screw here, clip screw, and final body screw, these all go into the liner internally. Once you've loosened all of those, you simply adjust the pivot to center so that your knife is right where you want it to be, or the blade is right where you want it to be, and then you go ahead and retighten. But you don't retighten one side at a time. What you do is you retighten this set of screws side to side, the clip screws side to side, and then the final screws side to side. Usually when we've done that, we've seen the centering completely correct itself, essentially by relieving the tension in the liners down here and then tightening the pivot to center, then retightening down the knife. You're pushing any slack, if you will, and it's pulling it and keeping everything lined up as you go down, and then everything is tight and in place. So usually that's going to fix it. In the rare cases where that doesn't fix it, if centering is a problem you're running into, then usually what's happening in that case is that on the pivot, you can see we're tooled on one side and one side only. Sorry, my camera is like backwards the way I'm shooting. This is atypical for me. So we've got a tool spot there, but no tool spot here. The pivot is D-shaped so that it is totally easy to adjust the pivot just from one side. But from the factory, they didn't include Loctite on this side of the pivot. So the way the pivot works, there's an actual barrel in there, right? The pivot barrel itself. And this side is a screw as well, just like this side is. It's just not tooled because we're D-shaped, so you don't necessarily need a tool there. But if that pivot barrel starts to work itself loose off of this pivot screw, then there's really no way to tighten that unless you disassemble the knife, which is kind of a bummer. So we may change hardware in the future to alleviate that and just make that a fixed component. But it's really not too difficult to deal with. I've taken apart a couple and Loctited them myself already. So if that's the case, then what we'll do is we'll just disassemble the knife completely. We'll remove this screw from that barrel, and then we'll Loctite it and reinsert it all the way tightened down. And then that way, once we let that Loctite cure, that side will be essentially non-movable the way it ought to be. So if you do that, then that usually chases out any remaining centering problems if you're still running into them. Because obviously if you get slack in the pivot, if it's coming loose on this side and you can only tighten this side, then there's only so much you can do to get it centered back up again. So I'm gonna go ahead and start on this knife by attempting the simplest method, which is just to loosen all of the body screws, center up the pivot, and then retighten them in that sequence that I mentioned. I'm assuming that will probably work based on the feel of this Avant, because everything in the pivot has felt right to me so far. So let's go ahead and see if that works. The Avant, all the hardware is T8, so I'm just going to use this one driver with a T8 in it. I do also have some lube here in case I need it, and I've got some Loctite in case I need it, and paper towels in case I need to do the Loctite. It's really a fairly simple knife to disassemble and reassemble because it's all just T8. All right, so we're going to go ahead and loosen these. I'm going to go so far as to just remove the screws completely. I figure that'll be the easiest way to do it. This tray, by the way, that I'm working on is made by Asphalt Trays. They're cool dudes. I've got 2 of these actually. Okay, there's 2 screws. So I can actually get that out. These screws are titanium, so if you're using a magnetic bit or bit driver, they're not gonna stick to it. I have seen already at least one person do a full hardware anodizing that looked pretty sweet as well. Alright, so we've got our clip screws, our clip, and all of the body screws. Come on. Almost all the body screws. If I could grab this one. There we go. Alright, so everything in the back end of the knife is now essentially off. There is still a pin that's holding the back spacer in place so it can kind of pivot, but it can't really come out at the moment unless I really let these scales flex. But what we're going to do now that we're all loosened up back here is adjust the pivot. I'm going to start by loosening. You can see it came right out that way. We're going to go to center. There's center right there. And now, while holding tension on the knife, like I mentioned before, we're going to go ahead and 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, tighten this back down. So body screw number 1 going in, body screw number 2 going in. You'll see my centering is staying the same as I do this. If I did one side, it would have the potential to pull again, which is not what I want. So make sure these are both actually tightened accordingly. Now, which side did I have the clip on? Clip goes over here, so I'm going to start right here with this clip screw. Move over here, get this clip screw in the right spot, and then get the clip on, and then tighten that clip screw down nice and tight. We're maintaining center, that's good. Now we're going to go back to this side, final body screw, easy peasy, final body screw, easy peasy. We've maintained center, so now the knife is centered just right. It looks perfect to me. And action is good. So we're there. In most cases, it's gonna be that simple. It's just those body screws are the key to the internal liners being lined up appropriately so that everything goes just right. The lock feels right, the action feels right, we're good. So this is an Avant that is appropriately fixed. Now I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna disassemble fully my Avant, and I'm gonna try swapping in some bearings, because on one of my prototype Avants I had run these are Gillian, or not Gillian bearings. These are from, oh goodness, Alpha Knife Supply. It says on here from Alpha Knife Supply. here's the information on them. These are the Delrin caged bearings, and I ran these on one of my prototypes for a little bit and it felt great. And this is one of the Avants that I've personally been carrying and using a whole lot. You can probably see the blade is got some stuff on it. So I think I'm going to do a bearing swap into it. And this one has actually come off center a little bit because I never Loctited this pivot. So this is a good opportunity for me to pull that Avant apart and then show you all of the internals, show you that the pivot internals and where you would Loctite that. I'll probably Loctite it while I'm in there, and then you can see all of how that works. So we're going to swap these in is the plan. I'm going to go ahead and put these in one of these little parts dishes here on the tray so I know what I'm working with. There's those. And we're going to rip into this guy. So disassembly is going to be pretty easy, just like I did on the other one. I'm going to remove some body screws, and we're going to get it pulled apart fairly quickly here. Bada bing, bada boom. Getting it all taken down. Alright, so there's all my hardware. I'm gonna put it into this little dish over here so I know right where it's at. And we've got to get the pivot, of course. Pivot on one side. Go ahead and open the knife. Pull that off. Pull that out. Might as well take that pin and that pin. Alright, so one thing you'll notice when disassembling is not only are there bearings, but you've got this little steel washer as well. The purpose of that is because these liners are titanium, and so it's better to have a ceramic ball riding on steel than it is titanium. So that's basically just to safeguard the titanium against the ceramic for the bearings. So you've got washer and bearing. You can see also there's a track on one side. When we reassemble, we're going to want to make sure that that track is facing those bearing balls again, so that it's going back in the same orientation that it was before. I do see I've got a little bit of lint and stuff in here, so I'm going to go ahead and give that a wipe down. I'm just using a paper towel, literally. I'm going to re-lubricate it when I'm ready to put it back together as well, so I don't mind drying it out a little bit. So there's the blade, and let me get these other internals out of here. So there's both of our bearings. Here is, oh yeah, look at this. All right, here's perfect example right off the bat. So this, let's see if I can get it just right. This is the pivot, and this side, non-tooled, right now is loose enough that I'm able to wiggle it with my fingertips. I didn't need any kind of tool to get that apart or anything. So what I'm going to want to do while I've got this apart is take this side all the way out, and we're going to Loctite that in. So I'm going to keep this in the orientation that it goes right there, and in a moment I'm going to Loctite that as kind of a first step. There's my other washer. I don't need to pull these liners out because I'm not doing a scale swap or anything. So I'm going to leave these liners in, but they're fairly easy to pull out. Basically, you just want to kind of pull on them enough to flex the material, get it to start separating, get a fingernail or something thin under it, and it pops right out. But they do fit in a very precise way. So they're tight in there, but they're not so tight that they're difficult to get out. And there's nothing holding them in. It's not like on a PM2 where the barrel spacer or where the lanyard tube is like going to give you big problems on getting it out or anything. All right, let's go ahead and Loctite this. So I'm going to just put this under here. I need to get one of those Loctite sticks. I feel like I'd prefer that because this thing always gives me drama, but that's all right. So we're gonna just put a little tiny dab. That's maybe even slightly too much. That's just like, you don't need a ton of this stuff. And I'm gonna try to be careful to not get it all over my skin, which I usually do. And we're just gonna thread this guy into here. And in reality, there's no reason why I would ever need to disassemble this part again. So being generous with the Loctite really isn't too much of a problem. I just want this to stay put from now on. And I want to do all of my adjustment from the other side of the pivot. So this side, I'm gonna wanna keep straight. I suppose you could, if you wanted to like set this at a really particular spot, like just barely extend it out or whatever, so you could chase like real drop shuttiness or whatever, you could do that. But I like my pivot to run tight, and with the bearings, the way they're set up on the Avant, I find the action is good with this side tight. So let that sit there. It's just gonna, I guess, begin curing until I get the knife back together. Now I'm done with the Loctite. I do also always recommend using blue Loctite on knives. It's, in my experience, the best. I don't like it when I see red Loctite and stuff being used. Blue seems to be the right level. All right, so we're disassembled. Let me show you real quick these bearings side by side. These new ones will probably need to wear in a little because they do have a different number of balls. So that's kind of interesting. These Delrin caged bearings, I've only ever used one other time. I got them kind of on a whim to try, and they worked great for me. A lot of people use skiffs. I'm trying to remember, I think this is the correct set of skiffs here. 3/16 with 1/16 balls, 0.050 thick. I think this is correct. It's possible it's not that. I'm almost positive that's the ones that are correct because I've got them kind of in the same section of my drawer. So hopefully that's right because I'm showing it on camera. But we're gonna go ahead and try out these Delrin bearings and see what our results are. So we're still gonna need the steel washers because we're still running ceramic on titanium if we didn't use those. And spacing wise, we're gonna need them. So these are the new components. I've set those brass caged bearings that come from Riyadh off to the side. So let's go ahead and get this into position. So I'm gonna start with the non-lock side, and we're gonna go ahead and get the pivot inserted into there. I'm gonna try to make a point to have the D-shaped section of the pivot facing downwards, so the slot where it's cut facing straight down, because on the opposing side you'll see that that's the way the D shape is going to line up when I put the knife back together. So try to keep that right there. It's a fairly tight fit, so it should reasonably stay put. Now I'm going to drop a steel washer down. I've got the track up toward me because that's what's going to run on the ceramic balls. Go ahead and apply just a tiny bit of knife pivot lube. A little goes a long way in my experience on KPL. So we've got that there. Stack the washer, or the bearings I should say, right there. And now that's ready to set the blade on. I suppose what I'll do actually as well real quick, this is kind of a, I don't know if you want to call this a hack or what, but in my experience, it's easiest before you get too many parts together to go ahead and at least loosely thread in the backspacer. Do it this way. Pin down, backspacer onto the pin. And now there's not much that can like fall off right now, so I'm going to just take a body screw and get that started. There's a lot of ways to skin a cat, I suppose. Quite a few people probably wouldn't do this step right now. They'd save it for later, but I'm not gonna tighten that. I'm just gonna have it so it holds it in place. That should make my job a little easier later. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and put just another small dab of lube on this side. It's okay if it gets on the barrel itself. That's actually a good thing. Now we're gonna take that, get the blade on there. Oh, those bearings feel good. They feel glassy. I'm gonna need my stop pin. Set that in real quick right there. That way everything is, again, being held in place a little bit more so. And let's go ahead and take a tiny bit of KPL, drop on each side, plop that right down in there. Now I need to make sure I've got the side that has the track, which is this side. Once I get some KPL, I'll place that down as well. Now my pivot assembly, if you will, all of that sandwich is back together. So I'm gonna take this, and in theory, if my D-shaped pivot is lined up and both my pins are lined up and the blade is out, I should be able to go ahead and get this to lock up. I'm gonna set the blade just barely in for a moment so that I can start getting it lined up, and then I'll extend the blade out. There we go. I can use the blade a little bit as well to position that D-shaped portion of the pivot if I need to get it to tweak just a little bit one way or the other. But we appear to be in the right position. So let's take another body screw real quick and loosely get the knife held together again. Not tight, just in. And then I'm going to take the pivot screw and I'm going to begin tightening that down as well. Alright, let's make sure we're locking up. Yes, okay. So it's actually being held on center at the moment, which is interesting too. So what I want to do is, it feels like lockup is having a little bit of trouble. Let me loosen these a little more. Make sure that I'm locking all the way up. And then from a locked position, I'm gonna tighten that pivot to where it ought to be, right about there. And I'm gonna go ahead and start putting this back together, the same sequence that I showed before. So first, I'm gonna wanna make sure that this screw and this screw are tight, then I'm gonna go clip screw, then I'm gonna go end screw, end screw. So moving my way down the knife, pushing all slack out away from the pivot. So let's tighten one here, one here, and then next is actually a clip screw, and this is going to be the clip side, so let me take that as well, get my clip screw just set but not tightened, slide the wire clip in underneath it, tighten that side down. And now the opposing side. If you really wanted to, you could Loctite each of these screws just a tiny bit. I find that on the body screws in particular, keeping them tight isn't really an issue. It's really just that pivot component that you want to make sure is Loctited. But if you have issues with screws backing out, then a little dab of Loctite is your friend. That back down there. And Sweet, we're back together. So it's really not that difficult of a platform to work on, in the sense that everything comes apart fairly easily, goes back together fairly easily if you know what you're doing and you know what's happening. So yeah, the big keys are knowing how these body screws relate to the rest of the knife, knowing that that internal portion of the pivot needs to be Loctited if you're having it come loose, and then that really should resolve pretty much any issue you're having with an Avant not fitting upright, not having the action that you quite want out of it. You can see now these Gillians too. This thing is, or not Gillians, these Alpha Knife Supply Delrin bearings. This thing is singing pretty well. I've seen quite a few people have great experience with skiffs in the knife. I've seen people use the Gillian salt and pepper bearings and have good experience with those. We don't have a problem with people bearing swapping their knives. If you create a problem while you're doing it, then we're not necessarily like obligated to fix a knife that you've broken because you were modding it. But if you're competent at tossing bearings in, then it shouldn't really be a problem. Yeah, bearing swaps are not that scary of a thing, and they do tend to improve the action over the factory bearings. The factory bearings are good, but they're not incredible. So some of these aftermarket ones are really nice, and I do notice a difference with them in. It gets real drop shutty. So there you have it. That one's sorted out. This one's sorted out. They're not that intense to work on, and it should be a pretty approachable thing. If for any reason you're not comfortable working on your knife and you're having centering issues or action issues, things like that, then you can definitely reach out to us and we can either help to coach you through it, or if it comes to it, we may just have you send the knife to us. But for most people, this should be totally doable. You don't need specialty tools other than an 8mm Torx, or sorry, a T8 25mm Torx. I literally keep a giant pack of these around because they're fantastic. They're just easy. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. Let us know if you have any questions or concerns or anything. You can email us, luftconcepts@gmail.com, or shoot us a DM on Instagram. And thank you so much for supporting our knife. We'll talk to you guys later.